Hi everyone, it's Donovan. Tonight, we step into a case that is as perplexing as it is tragic. A story that shattered the image of an all-American family and left a community, and indeed, the nation, searching for answers amidst a web of conflicting evidence, startling accusations, and enduring, painful doubt. This is the confounding case of the Armstrong Family Murders and the son who stood accused, Antonio Armstrong Sr. In the affluent Houston suburb of Bel Air, Texas, a neighborhood characterized by its manicured lawns, stately homes, and a pervasive sense of secure, family-friendly tranquility. The summer of 2016 was violently shattered by an act of brutality that seemed utterly incongruous with its peaceful surroundings. Dawn and Antonio Armstrong Sr., a prominent and beloved couple, both 42 years old, were ruthlessly attacked in their own home. They were shot while they slept, defenseless in the presumed safety of their master bedroom, during the deepest, quietest hours of the night on July 29th. Antonio Sr. was more than just a resident. He was a local hero, a Houston native whose athletic prowess had taken him from the fields of Kashmir High School to Texas A&M University on a full football scholarship, where he excelled as an All-American linebacker. His talent was recognized by the NFL. He was drafted by the San Francisco 49ers in 1995. Though persistent ankle injuries unfortunately curtailed his NFL playing time with teams like the Miami Dolphins, he transitioned to a successful 6-year career in the Canadian Football League CFL, where he distinguished himself, even earning the prestigious Defensive Player of the Year award for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in 2000. After retiring from professional football, he and his wife, Dawn, became pillars of their local business community, co-owning and operating first-class training, a popular gym in Bel Air. There, Antonio also poured his energy into being a personal trainer, a motivational speaker, and a passionate advocate for general health and fitness, touching and inspiring many lives within their community. The Armstrongs were, by all outward appearances, the very embodiment of success, happiness, and familial harmony, the kind of family often described as all-American. Admired and perhaps even envied, they were parents to 3 children: Josh, Dawn's son from a previous relationship, who was a college student in 2016, their 16-year-old son, Antonio Jr., affectionately known as AJ, a promising football player in his own right, and Bel, well-regarded figure at his school, and their 12-year-old daughter, Kira. Josh, although he had recently moved into his own nearby apartment, maintained a close and loving bond with his stepfather, Antonio Sr., and was extremely close to his younger siblings, AJ and Kira. AJ and Kira still lived in the family's spacious and comfortable home. On the evening of July 28th, 2016, a seemingly ordinary Thursday, the Armstrongs retired to bed around 10 p.m. Kira, the youngest child, performed her usual task of setting the home security system. Its sophisticated network of sensors on every external door, coupled with motion detectors strategically placed inside, was designed to create an impenetrable shield around the sleeping family, a modern fortress against any external threat. The master bedroom, where Dawn and Antonio Sr. slept, was located on the 2nd floor of their multi-story home. Kira's room was just down the hallway from her parents. AJ, the 16-year-old, occupied a room in the loft on the 3rd floor, a space he had previously shared with his older brother, Josh, before Josh moved out. For hours that night, an almost preternatural quiet enveloped the Armstrong house. The only discernible activity was AJ, awake in his room, texting his girlfriend, Kate, their conversations stretching into the early hours of the new day, until they finally called it a night just past 1 a.m. The events that were to unfold in the next hour would irrevocably alter all of their lives, plunging them into a vortex of tragedy and legal battles that would captivate and disturb the public for years to come. At precisely 1:40 a.m., the profound silence of the Armstrong home was violently broken. Antonio Armstrong Sr. made a frantic, whispered 911 call. He told the dispatcher, his voice hushed and strained, that he had heard gunshots, terrifying, explosive sounds emanating from within the house, hiding in the confines of his third-floor closet. He relayed his fears. He then reported that he had cautiously descended to the second floor and observed that the door to his parents' master bedroom was slightly ajar, a detail he found particularly alarming. As he specifically stated to the dispatcher, "They never leave it open, even a crack." He emphasized that he did not enter the room. The 911 call, which lasted for 16 agonizingly long minutes, captured AJ's hushed, sometimes trembling tones, his audible ponderings about how someone could possibly have gotten into their securely armed house, and a barely distinguishable, yet potentially significant, mention of a persistent ringing in his ear. Approximately 7 minutes into the call, he also made another ambiguous, almost inaudible utterance that sounded chillingly like "Mom" towards the end of the call. AJ, carefully following the dispatcher's instructions, entered the disarm code into the ADT security keypad located by the front door, deactivating the home security system to allow the dispatched law enforcement officers to enter. He and his younger sister Kira, whom he had awoken during the call, then walked out of the front door to meet the arriving officers, stepping out of what had been their sanctuary and into a horrifying new reality. Emergency medical teams, accompanied by police, rushed into the now accessible home. Their initial sweep confirmed no intruders remained. In the master bedroom, they found Antonio Sr., shot once in the head, but miraculously, still clinging to life. A faint pulse detected. He was immediately and carefully transported for emergency medical care. A desperate race against time. Dawn, lying in bed beside her husband, was tragically declared dead at the scene. The mother of 3 had sustained 2 gunshot wounds directly behind her ear. It was evident that both had been asleep when their assailant, or assailants, struck. A disturbing detail noted by first responders was that both Dawn and Antonio Sr. had pillows placed over their heads, as if to muffle the shots or perhaps as a final, macabre gesture by the killer. As officers conducted a further walkthrough of the residence, their attention was drawn to the kitchen. Several drawers were found hanging open haphazardly. Yet, paradoxically, nothing within them seemed disturbed, and no items were reported missing from the home. From one of these open drawers, a notepad and a pen had apparently been retrieved and were found left out on the kitchen counter. On the top page of the notepad, someone had roughly, almost aggressively, scrawled a chilling, taunting message. "I've been watching you for some time. Get me." The writer had gone over each capitalized letter multiple times, a technique often used in an attempt to disguise one's natural handwriting. Also on the counter lay a .22 caliber pistol. It was later confirmed to be Antonio Sr.'s own handgun. And tragically, the murder weapon, Antonio Sr., was known to keep the gun readily accessible in the drawer of his bedside table, a fact AJ himself had mentioned to the 911 dispatcher during that initial, frantic call. Investigators theorized that the gun was taken from beside the sleeping Antonio Sr. The forensic evidence, including the positioning of the bodies and the nature of the wounds, suggested that Dawn was shot first, twice, in quick, brutal succession. Perhaps the initial 2 shots caused Antonio Sr. to stir or awaken, prompting the killer to then turn the weapon on him as well. The initial assessment of the pristine crime scene, a home secured from the inside with no signs of forced entry, pointed to an obvious, yet deeply disturbing, suspect. The sophisticated home security system, with its comprehensive array of sensors, had not been breached. No external doors had been triggered to indicate an intruder. All windows were found locked, their screens still securely in place, making an exit through them for any supposed killer highly improbable. The weapon used in these horrific acts was already inside the house, belonging to one of the victims, and it remained at the scene when law enforcement arrived, not carried away by a fleeing perpetrator, with Kira, the 12-year-old daughter, accounted for, having been awoken by AJ during the 911 call. Suspicion quickly and intensely fell upon the only other person known to have been inside the locked and armed house that night, 16-year-old Antonio Armstrong Sr. In a move that underscored their initial assessment, AJ was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police cruiser, his world having imploded in a matter of hours. In the disorienting early morning hours that followed, HPD officers questioned AJ. They would later remark on his apparent lack of overt emotion during this period, noting that he shed no tears for his mother's brutal death or for his father's desperate fight for life in critical care. This perceived stoicism, whether it was a sign of profound shock, a trauma response rendering him numb, or something else entirely, seemed to fuel their growing certainty AJ must have been the shooter. They began to meticulously piece together their case, asking AJ to explain the dynamics of his relationship with his parents. "Yeah, we get really close, man," AJ stated in the recorded interview, his voice perhaps betraying a youthful naivety or a practiced calmness. He acknowledged some little issues with his mom, but insisted they were never anything like serious. He went on to describe generally close relationships with his father, his older brother Josh, and his younger sister Kira. It was also revealed that during the chaos of that terrible night, AJ had found the presence of mind to call his older brother, Josh, who lived just down the street and arrived at the Armstrong home shortly after law enforcement. While AJ was being questioned, the crime scene was being meticulously processed by forensic teams. However, the physical evidence, or rather the conspicuous lack of certain types of it, presented immediate and significant challenges to forming an open and shut case. No usable fingerprints were found anywhere in the house that could definitively point to an intruder, or even confirm AJ's handling of the weapon in the immediate context of the murders. Not on the gun itself, nor on the cryptic note and pen left out in the kitchen. Shell casings were recovered from the master bedroom, as expected. But crucially, additional casings were also found in AJ's third-floor bedroom, lending credence to a later admission. When questioned specifically about his father's gun, AJ initially claimed, with some vagueness, that he hadn't used it since he was about 8 years old, when they might have gone to a gun range. And he asserted that access to his parents' drawers where the gun was kept and the area under their bed was strictly off-limits to him. However, the investigation soon uncovered a critical piece of evidence that contradicted this initial denial: a bullet hole in the ceiling of the master bedroom, which had originated from AJ's room directly above. The entry hole in AJ's room was found crudely concealed by a pile of socks. When pressed by HPD on this damning discovery, AJ admitted to having fired the gun. He claimed he had been showing it off to a friend some weeks earlier and had accidentally discharged it at that time. Following this admission, police then found further evidence of firearm use in AJ's room: bullet holes in a pillow and a blanket discovered in his closet. Investigators were deeply skeptical of AJ's timeline for this accidental discharge, noting that fresh sheetrock dust was visible on the floor of the master bedroom directly below the bullet hole. strongly suggesting the shot was far more recent than AJ claimed. "If it wasn't this week, it was last week," AJ eventually conceded under questioning, his initial story crumbling. The bullet hole was not the only suspicious anomaly identified inside the house by investigators. On the second-floor landing, strategically located near the stairs, police identified a small, but noticeable, area of carpet that appeared to have been recently burnt. It was not a large marking, perhaps the size of a single match head that had been quickly stifled before it could catch properly and spread. However, the area around this small burn mark smelled strongly and unmistakably of gasoline. When questioned about this, AJ initially denied any knowledge, then confusingly suggested it might have happened on a Tuesday, and also mentioned that he and his father had previously noticed a gas smell in the house, but didn't know its origin. Investigators began to speculate that in the days or weeks leading up to the murders, AJ might have been attempting to set fire to the second-floor landing, a location that, if ignited, would have effectively blocked any escape route from the bedrooms on that floor. They also increasingly believed that the bullet-holed pillow and blanket found in AJ's closet were not from an old, careless incident, but rather evidence of a more recent test run of the shooting. Such a test, they theorized, would have allowed AJ to gauge how noisy the .22 caliber pistol was, and whether the shots could be heard from Kira's room loudly enough to wake her. For example, tragically, Antonio Armstrong Sr. succumbed to his critical injuries in the hospital, transforming the case into a double homicide. His son, AJ, now stood accused of 2 counts of capital murder. He was eventually released on a $200,000 bond, a decision that likely shocked many in the community. The motive, according to the prosecution, while not definitively established with a singular, clear-cut reason, appeared to be rooted in growing tensions over AJ's perceived deceitfulness and behavioral issues. Yet, if the sophisticated home alarm system was to be trusted, indicating no outside entry or exit, the case against him appeared overwhelmingly strong, at least circumstantially. But as the defense would later argue, significant issues with the direct physical evidence complicated this seemingly straightforward narrative. If AJ Armstrong Jr. was indeed the shooter that night, there was a perplexing absence of direct forensic evidence linking him to the immediate act of firing the gun. He had no discernible gunpowder residue on his hands, arms, or clothing. There was no blood spatter found on him, nor was any of his parents' blood discovered on AJ's person or caught in his hair. Critical omissions if he had been in close proximity to the shootings. No bloody clothing was ever found anywhere in the house. If the 16-year-old had been savvy and composed enough to thoroughly clean himself and the entire crime scene in the short window of time available, there were no telltale indications left behind of any cleaning products having been recently used in any sinks, showers, or drains. Furthermore, while DNA was found on the notepad and on the gun, forensic analysis determined that this DNA matched to the Armstrong family generally, but could not be isolated to a single, specific individual, a common result in items handled by multiple family members within a household. AJ, while eventually admitting he had lied to police about playing around with his father's gun to impress a friend, and initially blaming his younger sister for the mess on the stairway, possibly referring to the burn mark or gasoline smell, vehemently insisted that someone else had entered the house that night. He later claimed to investigators, some 5 hours after the initial 911 call, that he had actually seen that person, a man, wearing a mask, possibly African American and about 6 feet tall, running away from him and out of the house. This was a stark contrast to his initial 911 call, where he only mentioned that the door to his parents' room was opened a crack, making no mention of an intruder. Despite the horrific circumstances and the mounting circumstantial evidence against him, AJ's family, particularly his paternal grandparents, stood firmly and vocally behind him, convinced of his innocence. "We know him. That's the thing. We know our grandson," his grandmother stated publicly. "We know what he's capable of doing and what he's not capable of doing. And we know that he's not capable of murdering his mother and his father." AJ himself consistently maintained his innocence throughout the lengthy legal proceedings, expressing the profound pain of being accused of such heinous crimes while simultaneously grieving the loss of his parents. "There was somebody else in the house that night," he asserted. "And to know that this is something I'm being accused of just makes everything so much worse." Before AJ's first trial even commenced, a woman named Maxine Adams, who described herself as a friend of the Armstrongs, came forward to law enforcement with an explosive and alternative theory of the crime. Adams claimed that Antonio Armstrong Sr. had been involved in a sophisticated prostitution ring. Her own husband, she alleged, had also been involved. Through this illicit enterprise, she claimed, they had become connected with some dangerous and shady associates and had even received death threats prior to the murders. To AJ's defense team, headed by prominent Houston attorney Rick DeToto, this information, which they claimed had been improperly withheld by the state, was a bombshell. It offered a potential explanation for the murders that did not involve young AJ. In her interview with police, Maxine Adams reportedly backed up her claims with specific details, including names and phone numbers of people allegedly involved and how the operation supposedly worked. The Armstrong family's gym, first-class training, had also been broken into shortly after the murders, a detail the defense suggested could be linked. Although police found no direct connection, HPD ultimately found Maxine Adams' claims to be unsubstantiated. But with these rumors and curious activities playing out in the months following the killings, Rick DeToto capitalized on the information, telling the media that it was clear the state did not want the public to know what was really happening behind the Armstrongs' facade. A motion to have the case against AJ dismissed based on this new information nonetheless failed. AJ was 19 years old when his first trial for capital murder began in the spring of 2019. The defense, in a surprise and dramatic move, introduced yet another theory of the crime when they pointed the finger at a new suspect, Josh Armstrong, AJ's older half-brother, Dawn's biological son, and Antonio Sr., his stepson. In the years following the murders, Josh had tragically been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had begun to receive intensive psychiatric treatment. He had reportedly experienced paranoid episodes and disclosed having violent thoughts. His ex-girlfriend, Hannah Pylon, who had been living with him at the time of the murders, testified that while Josh was at home with her when she awoke after AJ's distressed phone call, she was unable to verify his exact whereabouts for the critical hours earlier that night when the shootings took place. She had simply assumed he had been sleeping next to her. Hannah also testified about Josh's significant mental and emotional decline following his parents' deaths. He reported hearing voices in his head, became increasingly paranoid, depressed, and developed an obsession with the details of the murders. Josh subsequently checked himself into a hospital for psychiatric treatment. Kira Armstrong, AJ's younger sister, by then a teenager herself, also took the stand. She testified as a character witness for AJ and to discuss the family dynamic. She told the jury that Josh had often been considered the black sheep of the family, that he perceived his parents loved AJ and her more than him, and that his demeanor had completely changed for the worse shortly after returning from college. Crucially for the defense, Kira Armstrong also gave testimony directly addressing the key piece of circumstantial evidence against AJ, the home security system logs. The system, she stated, was notoriously finicky. Kira recounted to the jury how the system often misfired, and that its sensors, particularly the door sensors, did not always work correctly, frequently failing to signal when external doors were opened or closed. She had even explained this to investigators on the very night her parents were killed. The defense aimed to systematically dismantle the prosecution's reliance on the alarm system reports, which showed no doors had been opened in the home for hours prior to law enforcement arriving on the scene. "Those records are not worth the paper they're written on," DeToto argued forcefully. "There are at least 77 different errors in those alarm records. Those alarm records are absolutely useless. And the whole state's theory that the house is closed and no one can get into it is nonsense." The prosecution, led by John Jordan, meanwhile, focused on what they portrayed as a growing and undeniable tension between the teenager, AJ, and his parents. They presented a series of text messages exchanged amongst AJ and his parents in the weeks and months leading up to the murders. These messages showed Dawn and Antonio Sr. expressing significant anger and disappointment over AJ's behavior, calling him a liar, and citing issues such as him smoking in the house, letting his grades slip dramatically, and repeatedly disobeying their rules. Dawn had written to her husband, "AJ is starting to lie. I am so disappointed. He doesn't care about anything. He is a bold-faced liar like I have never seen before." And it was revealed AJ had been kicked out of school due to failing grades, had broken curfew, been irresponsible with his car, and generally was not taking responsibility for his actions. 8 weeks before the murders, in a moment of apparent contrition or resignation, AJ wrote to his parents, "I'm not even going to try to say sorry for everything because right now I know it doesn't mean anything to you guys. I know I need a major life change right now." His mother's reply was filled with evident heartbreak and frustration. "We gave you all and the best we had. We wanted the best for you. We provided the best education, bought you a great car to celebrate you. We tried to be open with you and what was important to you, and all you do is lie to us, scheme behind our backs, chose to piss on all we tried to do. Beyond disappointed. I will never understand why you are a liar and do not work hard in school. You don't want to be right or do good. I am so heartbroken, but it is what it is." However, the defense countered that while some exchanges showed typical teenage angst and parental frustration, other messages also showed Dawn and Antonio Sr. offering praise to AJ for his efforts. His attorneys argued that his overall messaging history was not that of a homicidal son, but simply reflected the ups and downs of a regular teenager, who was also flirting with his girlfriend and making plans for the future just 90 minutes before the tragic events unfolded. The first trial was intensely emotional. AJ's former football coach, a close friend of Antonio Sr., broke down on the stand while speaking of his affection towards both father and son. AJ himself collapsed with his head in his hands when the court was shown graphic autopsy photos of his parents. He did not take the stand in his own defense. After over 19 hours of intense deliberation spread across 3 days, the jury sent multiple notes to the judge stating that they were hopelessly deadlocked. An 8-4 majority had reportedly voted to convict, but without unanimity, the judge was forced to declare a mistrial. The emotional toll on all involved, especially the Armstrong family members caught in the middle, was immense. The state of Texas, undeterred, almost immediately issued a statement of their intention to retry the case. When asked directly by media if he killed his parents, AJ responded, "No, never, never. Being in this situation and just that being a constant reminder that someone would even think that it's something that I would do. Like, it's just, like, it hurts. It's frustrating." The second trial was delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic and would not commence until 2022. By that time, AJ was 23 years old and had become a father himself. His son, Hendrix, was poignantly given the middle name Antonio, after both his father and the grandfather he would never know, AJ's girlfriend, Kate. had stood steadfastly by him since 2016 and would again take the stand to testify in his defense. There were some changes in the second trial. The security video of the alleged burglars breaking into the Armstrongs' gym after the murders was excluded from evidence. However, AJ's defense team had gained further support for their theory that it was the other son, Josh Armstrong, who was the shooter. Medical records for Josh had been obtained and were presented to the jury. These records disturbingly showed that Josh had, at one point, claimed to have witnessed his parents' murders, his own words seemingly placing him in the room that night. To the defense, this was tantamount to a confession. But the prosecution interpreted these statements as nothing more than a tragic symptom of his diagnosed schizophrenia, arguing there were no signs of severe mental illness in Josh before the murders, and that the horrific event itself had served as the trigger for his psychosis. They maintained that the murders were not the act of an individual experiencing a psychotic break. Much of the focus in both trials was painstakingly placed on the timeline as pieced together by cell phone records and the hotly disputed home security system reports. The alarm had been set at 9:52 p.m. by Kira, an undisputed fact. AJ was active on his cell phone, primarily texting with Kate, until 1:02 a.m., at which point it was placed on a charger, likely in his third-floor bedroom. The phone was then lifted from its charger at 1:08 a.m., but was not unlocked for use. 1 minute later, at 1:09 a.m., the motion detector on the second floor was activated. The phone screen was then turned on and off over the next several minutes, which would have given off ambient light, perhaps, the prosecution argued. To navigate the dark house, Dawn and Antonio Sr. were shot with Antonio's gun sometime between this period and the 911 call placed by AJ at 1:40 a.m. Notably, this was the only period of time all day that AJ was not actively using his cell phone. During that window, at 1:25 a.m., the living room motion sensor was activated. It is assumed by the prosecution that this is when the note and gun were left in the kitchen. Between this time and the 911 call, the prosecution speculated that AJ was cleaning up the scene and himself. The front door sensor was finally activated at 1:57 a.m. when AJ disarmed the system to allow law enforcement to enter. Then, as though to underscore the system's accuracy at certain points, 2 minutes later, the system report also showed the kitchen door opening, exactly in line with when responding officers performed their initial check of the property. The security system expert called by the prosecution, a man named Tim Rader from ADT, faced an intense and grueling cross-examination by Rick DeToto. The defense team had found what they deemed to be 77 distinct errors in the security report for the Armstrong house in the month of July 2016 alone. In the period from June to July of that same year, they identified over 120 failures in the system detecting movements, the majority of which, they argued, related to the opening and closing of external doors. "We know what this is," DeToto proclaimed to the jury, holding up the alarm logs. "This is the garbage can. The alarm records are that garbage. They are garbage." They further pointed to statements from Kira and others that the garage door would not always completely close. Yet the security panel by this door could nonetheless be armed by using a key fob, potentially creating a false sense of security. The defense's argument hinged on creating reasonable doubt, and the reliability of the alarm system was a cornerstone of that strategy. Prosecutor John Jordan, in his closing, argued that AJ had slipped up during the 911 call. He replayed a barely audible segment for the jury where AJ complains of a ringing or high pitch in his ears. "And there's this amazing thing," Jordan told the jury, "is if you fire a gun without ear protection, something happens to your ears. That wouldn't happen if you're in another room." He's saying, "There's a high pitch in my ears. This one statement is a confession. There's only one reason why you would have a high pitch in your ears, is because you just fired a firearm inside of a home. The state also emphasized what they argued was a foolish and unbelievable story told by AJ about the masked intruder. A story that only emerged 5 full hours after the initial 911 call, during which he made no such mention. You would think during a 16-minute 911 call, if he really saw someone running, he would have said, "Ma'am, I saw someone running in my house. Please get here. My sister's down the hallway," Jordan exclaimed. But to homicide investigators, if you're the only one in the house, if you're the one that committed murder, you've got to invent somebody. We all know from movies. The one-armed man. That's what this is like. In the first mistrial in 2019, the jury had deadlocked with 8 jurors voting to convict and 4 believing AJ was not guilty. In November 2022, after the second lengthy trial, the jury deadlocked again. This time, however, the numbers were reportedly reversed, favoring the defense, with a majority voting for acquittal. The emotional strain of repeated trials, the financial burden, and the unyielding uncertainty took a heavy toll on everyone involved. It's been 6 years. It's been 2 trials. It's been probably millions of dollars of expenses by the district attorney's office. Rick DeToto stated, "It's time to let this young man go." But the state remained resolute. The state of Texas has made clear their intention to try AJ Armstrong for a 3rd time. Jury selection for this unprecedented 3rd trial was initially scheduled for February 2023, with opening statements and testimony expected to commence in later March. The judge in the trial had filed an order to change the venue from Harris County, in part due to the immense media scrutiny the case has received and concerns about how this might impact the selection of a fair, unbiased jury. It remains unclear how these pre-trial proceedings and the change of venue may impact the ultimate timeline. But according to the state of Texas, since that tragic night in July 2016, one fact has seemed certain to them: Antonio Armstrong Sr. is guilty of murdering his parents. 8 long years later, they still need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt to a unanimous jury. The saga of the Armstrong family, a story of unimaginable loss and lingering questions, is far from over. Thank you for joining me as we've navigated the complex and deeply troubling case of the Armstrong family. It's a story that leaves us with more questions than answers, a stark reminder of how perceptions can diverge and how elusive certainty can be in the face of tragedy, especially when it tears at the heart of what we believe a family should be. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.